Minister, the first thing I want to do as we commence, or I commence my contribution on the Mother and Baby Home Redress Scheme is just remind ourselves that the crimes committed by the state and church against mothers and children were crimes that we have to learn from as a society, not just in Ireland, but across the world. And I think, given that after a very, very long struggle by the victims of various church and state institutions that persecuted, in particular, women, children, and in particularly working class women and children, and minorities, travellers, children of mixed race, and so on, it is important to see the relevance of that to current events in the world. And it would be wrong in discussing the crimes that church and state committed against women and children in this country in the aftermath of the Irish Revolution, not to mention the crimes that are being committed against women in Iran at the moment by the Iranian state, where a systematic regime of denying women self-determination and their rights to bodily autonomy and freedom and self-determination resulted in the murder of Mahsa Amini 40 days ago, a young Kurdish woman, because she refused to abide by the dress code of the moral police, just like we had our moral police in this country, who thought it was okay to incarcerate women because they didn't abide by certain religious rules, to stigmatise them, to stigmatise their children. We still see that happening today across the world. It's not exclusive by any means to Iran, but it's happening now in Iran, and we're seeing a heroic struggle of people across Iran, men and women, from different ethnic backgrounds, coming out in protest against the brutal treatment of women who just assert the right to be themselves, to determine who they are. And I think it's very important to say that at the moment, because there's such a strong parallel between Iran's history and Ireland's history. Iran, quite rightly, demands to assert its right to self-determination against the manipulation of Western powers who for many, many years tried to control that region, control that state, to install puppet regimes and so on. Very similar to the way Ireland was subject to the British Empire. And then they had a revolution, just like we had a revolution, in 1979, that overthrew a Shah, that declared self-determination, but then denies that self-determination to women. And that very strongly parallels what happened to the Irish Revolution, a revolution of great promise to liberate the Irish people from an empire, but then incarcerated women and children for decades and decades and decades and treated them as slaves, as second-class citizens, and so on. And it's outrageous that the Iranian regime is doing that, as much as I would absolutely assert the right of the people of the Middle East in Iran and elsewhere to stand up against Western manipulation of that region, and indeed the hypocrisy and double standards of some of those who wish to condemn them for various things. Nonetheless, it is shameful what the Iranian state is doing, and they should desist, and they should allow women and everybody in Iran the self-determination that they are demanding and that they are taking to the streets for. So I just feel it's important to say that and to point to those parallels, and maybe hope that the Iranian authorities are listening and understanding how, if self-determination isn't self-determination in every respect, you end up with what we've seen in this state, even after we were supposedly liberated from empires. Secondly, I'd just like to draw your attention to the fact that I received a message. This may have been said earlier in the debate, and so apologies I wasn't here earlier. I had to visit somebody in a hospital, but according to the Adoption Rights Alliance, the 30-day, the promise to get people's personal information to them within the 30 days that was promised by the government is now, they are hearing reports via the Adoption Authority of Ireland at least, I'm not sure what the situation is with TUSLA, is now not going to happen. That they are hearing soundings that that's not going to happen, and it may be more like 90 days and into January. So it would be interesting for the Minister to comment if he's aware of this, but certainly the message I've received is of grave disappointment that people are feeling after the long wait to get to this point, that there are now apparently significant delays in people getting the information that they have requested, their personal information about their history and so on. And I would ask the Minister to respond and indeed to do everything he can to do what's ever necessary to remedy that situation so that the promise that people would get that information is delivered upon. On the substance of the bill itself, I mean, these are points that others have no doubt made, and I really just will echo, I suspect, what others have said, and the Minister, I think, is well aware of the critiques that are coming from survivors' organisations, from the Irish Council of Civil Liberties, from the Association of Mixed Race Irish, and generally from survivors of the mother and baby home institutions. And the most, well, actually, there's quite a few problems with this. And although we're very glad to be sort of here at some level, and in fact, the fact that we are here is because of the relentless, brave, heroic campaigning of survivors who were let down so badly by the church and state, who were ignored for so long, fighting on with determination and bravery and heroism, and finally forcing the state to acknowledge the wrong that has been done to so many people by the church and state and insist that they get acknowledgement, apology and genuine redress. So in that context, it is very disappointing that the Minister has not responded to the points that were made about the completely arbitrary and unjustified basis for the 180-day cut-off point for being in institutions. I mean, I studied psychology, among other things, when I was in college, and one of the first things you do when you study psychology is you learn about children, you learn about child psychology. And to be honest, while there's many schools of thought in psychology and psychoanalysis, there is absolutely no dispute about people who study the development of human psychology is that literally the earliest hours and minutes and days of a child's life shape that child. So to have the trauma of being separated by force, in effect, by the perverted morality that dominated the Irish state, and the thought children should be separated from mothers if those mothers didn't abide by certain religious ideas and a certain twisted notion of religious morality, that didn't instantly have effects on those children and those mothers from the very second it happens. From the very second it happens. It will shape the psychology of children. And for many, and mothers, and for many, the damage and the trauma that is done in those, in those first hours and days and weeks will never ever leave them. So the idea that you can have an arbitrary cut-off where for 179 days, there's, what was the phrase that Catherine Connolly referred to as such a ludicrous phrase, a tabula rasa? It's, it's a nonsense, a clean slate up until 180 days where you're not affected, but on day 181, now you're a legitimate case that deserves redress. It's preposterous, utterly preposterous. And it sort of subverts the integrity of the apology of the state. It subverts and undoes the integrity of the acknowledgement the state has supposedly done to suggest such a thing, that it can be, you know, valued in that way, that for 179 days, if you were in an institution, really no harm's been done, but on day 180, harm was done. And after that, we're on a sort of escalating scale. That's nonsense. It's just nonsense. And even at this stage, the minister should change that and respond to what is self-evidently the case. The amount of time you may have spent in an institution is not the key factor. Okay, it is the crime that was done to all in those situations, and then how that particularly impacts on people, and the trauma that they suffer as a result of that forced separation, incarceration and stigmatisation, all of the things that go with it. And indeed, you know, I'm very well aware, as somebody who's an adoptee myself, you know, there are good outcomes and there are bad outcomes, but everybody's affected. But some are affected in very, very different and more damaging ways, and that is not something that you can correlate in some sort of mechanical way according to the number of days you spent in an institution. And quite frankly, it is insulting to suggest that you can. It is also, as has been said, it's a matter of sadness that the minister has not acknowledged the pain, really, and anger that survivors, mothers and children who went through the mother and baby home regime feel at the report, at the mother and baby home report, which informs this, and the failure to fully give weight to and acknowledge the testimonies of the survivors themselves. And as the ICCL point out, the minister did promise a review, and that review has not happened. I said on day one of that report in the Dáil, I described it as a whitewash. And I still believe that to be the case. It was a whitewash. Because to downgrade the direct testimony of the survivors in the way that it did, and to have an insulting summary, as was the case, which uses phrase like no evidence, that they were not incarcerated in the strict, quote, in the strict meaning of the word, that certain evidence was, quote, the product of a creative writing class, etc., is just outrageous, completely outrageous, insulting, compounding the pain and the trauma that people felt. So that review should have happened, and indeed that review and that rejection of that sort of summarisation of the experience of all those who went through the mother and baby home scheme should have been the precondition, really, for establishing the bill, the redress bill. The other issues that have been pointed out, again, I'm sure, to the minister already, is the no specific compensation for illegal adoptions, for forced labour, for unlawful vaccine trials, abuse as adopted child, or death, or specific provision for discrimination where systematic racism was at work. And as the minister knows, this issue was highlighted by many, including the UN special rapporteurs. The fact that the bill provides payment in terms of, quote, work-related payment, rather than what it was forced labour, and acknowledging that it was forced labour, slavery in effect, of the women that were incarcerated, is unacceptable. The fact that the issue of absences from the institution are not provided for, where there may have been I'm sure almost certainly there were definitely good reasons, as the ICCL pointed out, in some cases for people escaping from these institutions, but the period for which they might have escaped is not accounted for in terms of their residency in the institution. The fact that in the general scheme of the bill, it was referred to the fact that there would be an enhanced medical card, and that's been replaced by health services without charge, but only for somebody who's resident for 180 days. Again, the completely arbitrary 180 days. And for those survivors outside of Ireland, the medical compensation, if you like, is only €3,000, which, you know, again, a completely arbitrary and totally inadequate figure, and they do not get the commitment to all the health services they need and being provided not without charge. The bill also doesn't provide specifically for trauma-informed counselling and therapies as survivors has called for. And also the provisions of the bill which rule out the possibility of people availing of the scheme if they've already taken legal action and got a court settlement in respect of the period in the institution that the bill covers. The downgrading also of the requirements for the Chief Deciding Officer in terms of advertising the fact of the redress scheme, and in particular the fact that the bill does not expressly require for advertisement abroad, as against the general the general scheme of the bill, which did provide for that. I'm sure the Minister has probably read a lot of these, so I don't really need to to rehearse them all. But certainly, judging from the communications I'm receiving, there's a lot of people who feel there's a lot needs to change and be amended in this bill to address those concerns. But I'll just conclude by saying the worst thing of all is that arbitrary 180 days. That's just, it is an insult and it needs to be changed, Minister. And the full acknowledgement of how insulting the mother and baby report was in its summary of, and essentially dismissal of the testimonies of the survivors is a pretty deep insult. And I think people now feel that the inadequacies in the bill show a sort of failure to fully, despite apologies and so on, to really take on board the trauma and the suffering and the hurt, if you like, that people have experienced at the hand of this brutal regime that did so much wrong to so many women and children.